Welcome to this Center for Security Policy webinar. I'm Frank Gaffney, the executive chairman and founder of the center, and very proud to be the moderator for a, breakfast briefing, we're calling it, on a very important development, arguably of historic proportions, that took place last week in the Holy Land, the heart of the Middle East. It involved the election of Benjamin Netanyahu to another term as Prime Minister of Israel, and brought him to power not only in that role, but at last with an actual majority of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, to help him govern, something that has been missing in Israel for most of the past 4 years. This is an opportunity for not just Israel, but for the United States to, reboot at a moment when such a course correction is incalculably needed for a host of reasons, internal to Israel, certainly internal to the United States, I would argue, but especially in light of various forces at work beyond those two nations, notably in the Islamic Republic of Iran, at the cusp of acquiring nuclear weapons, if it has actually not already done so, and in the midst of a revolutionary upheaval. Its proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, now armed to the teeth by the Iranian regime, spoiling for fights, it appears, and capable of inflicting incredible damage on the state of Israel. Then there are the Palestinians, who have been greatly encouraged of late by the Biden administration and the European Union and others to return to their aggressiveness against Israel, both from the Gaza Strip, from the areas that the Palestinian Authority nominally controls in Judea and Samaria, and from inside Israel proper, all of which is to say, a world of hurt is at play at the moment. And this conversation with an extraordinary group of experts on the various subjects I've touched on is very timely and very needed, because we believe there is a chance now to do something that has not been done, really, with the exception, I guess, of the 4 years of the Trump administration, since the Oslo Accords, which is to say, to have a truly special relationship between the United States and Israel. We're going to talk about that history. We're going to talk about the reason that we've departed from that special relationship. We're going to talk about why it's needed now more than ever, and why a new committee made up of, among others, members of the group that you will be hearing from today, has come together to try to restore the U.S. Israel special relationship at this juncture. And we'll get into a bit more of that in due course. But begin this conversation appropriately, we're going to start with Carolyn Glick Suiza. She is a remarkable, national security policy practitioner, originally from the United States, who made Aliyah to Israel a number of years ago, has served in its military, has actually worked for Benjamin Netanyahu in a previous premiership as a senior advisor and national security aide. She is these days a virtual one-woman media phenomenon in Israel, a columnist, appears very frequently on television, has had her own television show, a Caroline Glick podcast, and more. And we're always delighted to have a woman who I'm proud to say is, among other things, a senior fellow of our Center for Security Policy with us to kick things off. And we've asked her to talk a bit about the nature of the mandate that Benjamin Netanyahu has received, how he got it, and what he must now do with it. Caroline Glick, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Frank, for having me on this very, very important webinar. So just very briefly, uh, former and now incoming Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is back for, I think it's unprecedented that we have a leader in any country that's managed to make a comeback to power, not once, but twice. We've had several leaders who have made comebacks once. Here in Israel, we had Ben Gurion and Yitzhak Rabin, along with Benjamin Netanyahu. You had Churchill in the United Kingdom, but this is actually the second time that he's done it. So this is really sort of a stunning accomplishment personally on Netanyahu's part. But there were two aspects that really caused, or really three aspects, reasons that Netanyahu was able to pull off this second comeback in last week's elections. The first one had to do with the structure of the elections, or which is that, Israel is a parliamentary democracy. We don't have Republicans on the one hand and Democrats on the other. We're a multi-party parliamentary democracy. And in order to become prime minister, you have to form a coalition with a majority of the members of, with a majority of Israel's 120 seat Knesset. And a coalition is never just one party, it's always many parties. And those parties sometimes run against each other and come together after the elections to form a coalition government. And sometimes they run as a bloc, which is what happened this time on both sides. And Netanyahu, and on the other hand, we have a threshold. If you have the electoral college, which sort of muddies the water, so it's not simple majority. In Israel, we have something called an election threshold, where in order to get elected to the Knesset, you need to have 4 seats. You need to reach not only 1 seat. A party doesn't only have to reach 1 seat in the Knesset, but it needs to be able to get 4 members of its list elected. That's a 3.25% threshold. If you don't get 3.25% of the vote, which is equal to 4 seats, then you can't get in. And all the votes that were given to your party are just going to be lost to your side. And so in the run up to the election, Netanyahu very smartly ensured that none of the parties in the Likud's block of right and religious parties were in any danger of crossing the threshold, of not crossing that 3.25 threshold. He put together 2 parties that represent various factions of the religious nationalist community in Israel, and really just forced them, compelled them to run together, even though they have disparities in their views and disputes among their leaderships and their members. He got them to run together. And the minute that he did that, he essentially ensured that none of the parties in his block of parties would be in any danger of crossing that threshold. On the other hand, Yair Lapid, the outgoing prime minister, did not do the same with his camp. He allowed 2 small far left parties, the Labor Party, which led Israel in its first 3 decades of existence, and the far left Meretz Party to run separately. And the minute that they decided to run separately, both of those parties were in danger of not crossing the threshold. And at the end of the day, the Meretz Party did not cross the threshold, and the Labor Party just barely crossed it. And so too, on Lapid's side, you had the Arab parties, and they had run all together in the past. In the second round of elections, they split into 2 parties. And you had one party, a larger party that was comprised of 3 Arab parties running together. But then before this round of elections, one of the 3 parties split off again, so that you had 3 Arab parties running. And then the minute that happened, all 3 Arab parties were in danger of not crossing the 3.25% threshold, and indeed one of them didn't. So the combination of all of the parties on Netanyahu's right religious bloc side crossing the threshold, and 2 of the parties in the left Arab bloc not crossing the threshold, enabled the result that we saw, which is 64 seats for the right religious, the bloc, and 56 votes for the left Arab bloc, 46 for the left, 10 for the Arabs. So that was one thing. Another thing that happened was that we had these elections after a year and a half of governance by the left Arab coalition that's now about to go into the opposition. And, for many years, Netanyahu had been continuously the prime minister for 12 years. And people started taking for granted that everything that was being done, Israel's extraordinary economic advances, its regional rise as a power, as a regional power, and its global rise as an economic power and strategic ally for many, many countries around the world, that was all just, anybody could do that, and that nothing was in danger and that everything was fine. And after a year and a half of having the most radical post-Zionist, post-nationalist, anti-Zionist, and in some aspects anti-Jewish government that we've ever seen in charge of running Israel, to extraordinary detriment both to our economy, to our society, to our regional standing, to our global standing, and to Jewish life in this country, you had a lot of people feeling like the country itself was standing in the balance as we went to the polls. I know I was one of them. And as a result, you had a lot of people who hadn't voted in previous two rounds of elections coming out to the polls in a pretty significant way to vote for Netanyahu, Likud, and the three other parties in the right religious bloc. So that vote was up on the right and among the religious parties. Vote was somewhat down, not a lot, but enough down on the left to make it decisive. And although the Arab parties had a higher vote than they had in the past, since they're only a fifth of the electorate, the rise in Arab voting wasn't enough to surpass the rise in voting among right-wing voters in Israel. So those two things really caused the electoral majority that we've seen. And I think that the final thing that we saw was just that the message that the right had going into the elections was much clearer, much more easily understood by voters than the left. The left didn't really have a good message except for its old message, which is that we want to block Netanyahu from coming back to power. But after a year and a half of having the left and the Arabs in office, that had a lot less resonance than it had in the past. And they didn't have a clear policy that was attractive to voters. So I think I'll just leave it at that. And in terms of the challenges, is to repair much of the damage that the outgoing government has caused to Israel's economic standing, Jewish life in this country, Israel's relations with our Arab neighbors in the region, Israel's ability to withstand aggression by the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, its ability to deal with the restive and increasingly irredentist Arab Israeli community within Israel's sovereign borders, and Israel's relationship with the Biden administration, which is widely viewed, I think accurately, as being the most hostile U.S. administration that Israel has ever faced.
Carolyn, thank you. That laundry list at the back end is, I think, what we will spend some time exploring with you and our other guests. And I appreciate you setting the stage so well for, well, an understanding of what has happened inside Israel and its implications for the people of the Jewish state, but also the opportunities that it's thus created. So thank you and well done. Next up, we're going to speak to Dr. David Wormser. He is another of our colleagues at the Center for Security Policy. David Wormser has had a number of roles in the United States government. He has been a naval intelligence officer. He has served with the Vice President of the United States, with the National Security Advisor, with the Undersecretary of State, in, again, critical advisory capacities, helping them with Middle East policy decision-making. And he brings, as a result, a wealth of expertise to his current role as the director of the Mideast programs of our Center for Security Policy. We've asked David to talk a bit about the history of the U.S. Israel special relationship, and specifically to discuss how it was fundamentally transformed at one point and what we need to do now in order to renew it and the importance of doing so. David Wormser, it's wonderful to have you with us as always. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Frank. It's an honor to be on the panel with everybody. It's truly some of the best minds out there. Frank, in your introduction, you mentioned the Oslo Accords, and you mentioned how that was sort of a watershed moment. And I can't emphasize how correct you are on that. Up until the Oslo Accords, there was a special relationship between Israel and the United States. Now, I have some reservations over some of the characteristics of it prior to that, but there was a special relationship. You had Henry Kissinger, for example, who was no great friend of Israel, understood strategically that whatever move the United States needed to make that affected Israeli interests, he would meet with, at the time, Ambassador Rabin, and then Prime Minister Rabin, or the other ambassadors that were in Washington, which included Herzog's father at one point was in the UN. But at any rate, the United States would coordinate its foreign policy with Israel as it touched on Israeli interests before they would go more broadly and talk to others about these issues. So if there was a peace issue like an international conference, they would coordinate their positions with Israel first. The second thing that was important was that the United States understood in the context of the Cold War that America had an ally in the region that was this sort of the front line of the Cold War. So there was this strategic understanding that there was something unique about the Israeli relationship that stood on its own legs. It didn't need anything else. It stood on its own legs. Come Oslo, and ever since Oslo, the pattern has been to pair Israel with the Palestinians. If a Secretary of State, a president goes to the Middle East, goes to Israel, he has to go and visit the Palestinians. You can't just visit Israel anymore. If there's some sort of a visit by an Israeli prime minister, it has to be balanced by a visit by a Palestinian official. So what you saw was the reduction of the uniqueness of that relationship, and it's paired with, frankly, one of America's greatest enemies, or adversaries, the PLO. The second thing was the content of that. Before, it was a strategic communication with Israel about larger regional issues that Israel was involved with or could have be affected by. After that, the entirety almost of the American diplomatic effort and energy in its relationship with Israel has been the peace process. So not only are we pairing Israel with, frankly, an adversary of the United States, but we diminish the value of the Israeli relationship to essentially an albatross that has to come around and make life easier for us. So the entirety of the American-Israeli relationship was no longer special. This got a much tougher kick under the Obama administration, where there were, frankly, moments of outright hostility, whether it's some of the meetings or whether it was the UN vote about Jerusalem at the very end of the administration. We were actually, at some point, tilting away from the Israelis and developing, frankly, a special relationship with the Palestinians and the Palestinian issue. So really, if I were to describe any special relationship the United States has, except for the Trump administration, which I'll get to in a moment, if I were to really describe that relationship, we have a special relationship with the peace process, not with Israel. So if Israel doesn't do what we essentially believe is in the interests of the peace process, we have a problem with Israel. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot that we ever have a problem genuinely with the Palestinian side. But so the Trump administration was a fundamental shift from that. It basically absorbed the idea that the United States had committed a tremendous amount globally to upholding freedom in the world, and that we were becoming tired, and that we needed to turn inward on some level. So we needed strong allies that would be untethered to essentially carry the water for American interests in the region. And so what we did was we encouraged the rise of a regional bloc of friendly nations, the UAE, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, which eventually, three of those four formed the peace treaty, really a strategic alliance. And that bloc no longer was just a special relationship. That bloc was the American foundation to our continued presence in the region at a time when we couldn't commit anymore as much as we had in the past. So again, the special relationship arose. It arose in a more solid strategic content. And then finally, there was this belief that Israel was coming into its own, that it was becoming very powerful. And as a powerful nation with a lot of economic assets to contribute to the world, it became itself a major strategic objective of the United States, not just for what it can do in the region, but as itself. Much say the way the war was for steel production at the end of World War II, we defined that as a major strategic interest because the economic dependence of the West on that was so great. Well, the Israelis as an incubator of innovation and the role they play in the global economy now, not just their own innovation, has made them essentially a global interest economically for the West. So the relationship shifted under the Trump administration. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is it's shifting back to the old view, which is there is no Israel relationship without it being filtered through the peace process, through Israel's behavior toward the peace process. And the content of it is, again, some idea that we don't have any relations in the Middle East that could continue if we don't get the Israelis to behave. So again, we're going back to the old paradigm. The Middle East has moved on. They don't care anymore about whether there's Palestinian-Israeli peace for continuing and proceeding in their own relations. There's no veto anymore for the Palestinians. But the United States is now reinstating that veto. And it was really exemplified with this regional summit that was held half a year ago, which frankly was one of the causes of the destruction of the previous Israeli government. We are trying to take the Abraham Accords, the peace treaty between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain sort of on the sidelines, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Sudan. We were trying to take that peace treaty structure, that accord structure, and bend it back into the Oslo process where it was all about the Palestinian issue, which was not why anybody was there. And the reason, and that led to, in my view, a real failure of that summit. But more than that, it put the Israeli government in a position where it forced the Palestinian issue back to the front of the agenda in internal Israeli politics. And when it did that, this government no longer had a consensus, didn't have a majority, and it was inevitable that then it would fall. So they essentially killed themselves. The United States kind of killed itself by, in terms of pushing its unique policy, or not unique, but consistent policy other than the Trump administration. It sort of killed its ability to do so by bringing down the government that was doing it with them. So in conclusion, I think I'm going to leave it with that. There are other aspects of the special relationship that I think bear reexamination going all the way back to the Kissinger years. But for the moment, I think that's probably good enough to get kicked off here.
No, it's a splendid overview of the special relationship, its checkered history, and very importantly, David, your comment about how it was the United States interference with the Israeli internal political dynamics that brought down the previous government. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, in Q&A about other forms of interference, including in the election itself by the United States government and some of its proxies. but we'll reserve on that for the moment to take stock with Dr. Harold Rode, a man who served as really the go-to duty expert in the United States Defense Department for several decades on matters involving the Middle East, particularly its culture and some of the most problematic forces in the region, notably that of the government of Iran, but also Turkey and the Gulf states. Informed by his personal time in and deep scholarship about the way that those in the region think and what they think about. And it's in that context that we're very anxious to have his insights into the attitude of friendly governments, relatively speaking, at least in the region, to the U.S. relationship with Israel, and why it matters that it is special and strong to others who have sometimes been regarded properly as deeply hostile to the Israelis, but at the moment at least seem very much of the view that they want a strong and secure Israel, especially at a moment when the United States is proving to be rather problematic in terms of its reliability, to say the least. To do all this, we're going to talk to Dr. Harold Rode, and I'm very proud to say he is a close collaborator with us at the Center for Security Policy on these matters, and we're always delighted to have the benefit of his thoughts. Dr. Rode, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Frank. I'd like to talk about the people in the Gulf, the Arab countries there, and how they see this. In the beginning, I would say what David Wormser just talked about. They saw the United States as the guarantor of their security, of their existence. And it was sort of like what the former Israeli ambassador to Washington, Ron Dermer, used to say, the 800-pound gorilla in the area. That gave them, they're relatively weak, and they needed an outside protector. But as America began to abandon them, they needed to look for other sources of support. They have two enemies. It's not Israel. Israel never threatened them. Two enemies were the government of Iran, which it's a Shiite power. Most of the Gulf is ruled by Sunnis. And for us, they're just two forms of Islam, but they hate each other. And they knew that Iran wanted and still wants to take them over and to destroy the leaderships of all these countries. That's number one. And their other enemy is Sunni extremists, as Sunni Muslim fundamentalists. And this is represented by the Muslim Brotherhood. The problem with both the Obama and Biden administration is that both of them chose and continue to choose to kowtow to Iran and kowtow to the Muslim Brotherhood extremists, which meant they are a total threat to these Gulf countries. And they were looking for someone who could help them, since America, for whatever reason, chose to bow out. And again, to quote Ron Dermer from that I mentioned before, and if they couldn't have the 800-pound gorilla, well, Israel could be the 250-pound gorilla. And Israel had exactly the same enemies to deal with: the Iranian government and the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this is why they signed, that is, the Emiratis, the UAE and Bahrain signed the Abraham Accords with Israel, because as as David Wormser pointed out before, America was either unwilling or unable to protect them. And Israel, again, did not represent a threat to them. Now, to show, see, the Arabs in the Gulf don't necessarily say directly what they think. That's not part of their culture, but they demonstrate how they feel. Well, oh my God, the press here in the West and in America and Europe and the intellectual establishment in the United States and a lot of senior so-called experts in the American government were saying, oh my God, this is the new Israeli government that that Netanyahu will be able to form is nationalist, it's extremist. But the Gulfies, the people in the Gulf, obviously have a different view of this. Why? Already since the elections, the Bahrainis, the country of Bahrain, they publicly said, we were negotiating a free trade agreement with Israel, and now we want to go full speed ahead. We need Israel. We need a strong Israel. We need Netanyahu. Now, that's one. Number two, Mohammed bin Salman, who is the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, where do they stand? Since World War II, America basically protected the Saudi government. Are they the greatest thing since sliced bread? No. All of these countries, frankly, are top-down countries. We think that individuals have rights. In the Middle East, that's not how they see the world. It is groups that have rights. It could be families, clans. I, for example, I'm not Harold Road. The Harold is secondary. I'm Harold of Road. And the Road clan decides how things are done. And that's how, for example, Saudi Arabia also works. And so most of the Gulf countries. And they know if they had an election of one man, one vote, as the late and great Professor Bernard Lewis used to say, there would be in true free and fair election, one vote, one man, one vote, one time. Man, he emphasized, not women. So that means we'll use the democratic system of like voting and to get to where we want, which is to take over, that is the bad guys there. Now let's look at what Mohammed bin Salman, or he is affectionately called MBS, the abbreviation, what he said. He wants America to lead. He recognizes that the America of the past and the Israel of now under Netanyahu before, and they return now with Netanyahu, is strong, and they can help protect Saudi Arabia. Now, how do we know this? He doesn't come out and say, I love America. How do we know how he loathes President Biden and the present American administration? You can love America, but not like the rulers. And that is when President Obama came to Saudi Arabia recently, when he lands, he is met by a local deputy governor of the area. Protocol would indicate, and the Middle Easterners are very concerned about protocol, that the king, and if he was unable, his deputy, in this case, it would be the crown prince, which is MBS, would meet him. Well, that didn't happen. And to make matters more clear, in Saudi Arabia, who, for various reasons that we don't have the time to go into, they loathe the Palestinians and they loathe Jerusalem. Why? Because their intellectual godfather, who lived in the late 1200s and early 1300s, who was an anti-Semite, hated Jerusalem because he said there was nothing more than a Jewish attempt to Judeify Islam. There are only two holy cities, Mecca and Medina. Now, how do they express this? There's no free press in Saudi Arabia, and there are no media of anything, which is free. It's all government controlled in some form. They're allowing bloggers, the Saudi government, to for example, say that the Al-Aqsa Mosque that the Muslim Brotherhood loves so much in Jerusalem is fake. The real Al-Aqsa Mosque, which means the furthest mosque, is about 20 miles northeast of Mecca. And there's bloggers that go on and talk about this. There are bloggers who sing songs about the glories of Bibi, Ya Habibi, Bibi, oh my beloved friend. In Saudi Arabia, you can see all of this on the net. It's on Twitter, it's podcast galore. And now that Netanyahu is back, they're breathing a sigh of relief. Now, just to put all this together, if somehow the 800-pound gorilla of the past, the United States, and the 250-pound gorilla, Israel, of today, could work together, that would be an amazing thing for all of our erstwhile Gulf allies. You'd have in this case, you'd have a 1,050-pound combination gorillas. And it would be wonderful. Now, it requires basically the Americans to realize that a strong America in alliance with a strong Israel makes pretty much of everybody happy in that region, except Iran, except the Muslim Brotherhood. And if, for example, the results of the elections here in the United States tomorrow are bring, I would say, a more sense of saneness and reality back, maybe we have a chance to strengthen again the Israel American relationship, and at the same time with our Gulf allies. Thank you.
Dr. Howard Rode, thank you. Very important, sort of cultural environment assessment that further underscores the importance of what we're about with our committee to renew the U.S. Israel strategic relationship, or cruiser, if you will, in short. We're going to talk more about what we hope to do with this informal coalition in a moment. But before we do, I want to get the inputs of several of our other speakers. Most immediately, Morton Klein, the president, the national president of the Zionist Organization of America, an extremely important organization in the battle space of American supporters of Israel's efforts to assure the survival of the Jewish state and the incredibly important interests the United States has, both in Israel being, well, not just extant, but also formidable as a force for good in the Middle East in ways that Dr. Rode has just described. Morton Klein, I'm very proud to say, is a longtime friend of mine and of our organization. He is indeed a keeper of the flame from the Center for Security Policy. He is also a man who is quite accomplished at giving awards of his own, and will be shortly next weekend after next, I should say, giving one to former President Donald Trump. And very pleased because it sets perfectly the stage for a conversation with Mort about the contributions that Donald Trump made during his presidency to returning, as we've discussed a little bit just now, to that special relationship. Alas, a moment in time that has now been reversed by the present U.S. government under Joe Biden, but one that I think is a model for what we need to go back to and see what we can do to support as a coalition and as individuals. Morton Klein, it's great to have you with us, and I appreciate your time at this early hour. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. By the way, it's this Sunday night. We're giving this Sunday night in New York City, Pier 60. We're giving our rarely given highest award to Donald Trump, the Theodore Herzl Gold Medallion. ZOA has only given this over the past century to Lord Balfour, Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, Golda Meir, Ben Gurion. So it's a rare appreciation of an extraordinary friend of Israel, and it's remarkable that I and ZOA have been attacked by the Israeli media, Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, JTA, many others, bitterly attacked for honoring Donald Trump, which is rather extraordinary since, of course, there was no president that ever did as much for Israel as Donald Trump. I tell people, if I was the president of the United States, I couldn't have done more for Israel than he did, from moving the embassy to recognizing the Golan Heights, to cutting all aid to the Palestinians until they stopped paying people to murder Jews, which they've never done. He's the first president to have prayed at the Western Wall, the first president to do that, and many, many other achievements. And we're also having, by the way, someone who will be the new Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, and Jason Greenblatt, one of the architects of the Abraham Accords. Well, I wasn't too sure. Oh, by the way, I also want to say that I'm proud to say that Harold Rode and I went to the same high school 1 year apart. We're both Philadelphians. So I want his prestige to be bestowed upon me because of that. In any event, so what can I say? I think one of the biggest problems as to why Israel is not more supported in this country, maybe throughout the world. I'm not sure this is appropriate for this meeting, but I'm going to discuss it anyway. We don't tell the truth about the key issues. We don't tell the truth about Jerusalem, which the Arabs continue to say they want part over all of. It is not holy to Muslims. It has never been mentioned in the Quran. Muhammad went from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque. And the Arabs say this meant Jerusalem. Well, it didn't say Jerusalem. And there was no mosque in Jerusalem when Muhammad made this journey. And it was a dream, it didn't even really happen. The majority of people living in Jerusalem since the first census in 1850 were Jews, not Muslims, and on and on. We should be making it clear that Jerusalem is not holy to Muslims or partially holy to Muslims, but we don't do that. We should be making it clear that there's no occupation. I'm talking about Jewish leaders and Israeli leaders and the Jewish media, both in Israel and here, and explain how there's no occupation. There was never a country named Palestine. When I speak to college groups, they're shocked that there was no country named Palestine. They assume it was Palestine and Israel took it over. We don't make this clear in any way, shape, or form. And you all know the details, proving that it is not an occupation. Moreover, we should be making clear Israel has transferred all of Gaza, 40% of Judea and Samaria, to Arab control. That's where 99% of the Arabs live. They live under their own rule. So there's not even an occupation in that respect. And yet, Jewish leaders actually mention there's an occupation. So Israeli leaders harming Israel's stance in the world. And maybe the most important thing is Mahmoud Abbas. I mean, it's rather extraordinary that we have people now throughout the world attacking Ben Gvir as this monster extremist right-winger, a Kahanist, all of which is essentially false. But Mahmoud Abbas is viewed as a moderate peace seeker. We say nothing about it. Israelis don't. Jewish leaders don't. This is one of the monsters of the world who pays Arabs a lifetime pension to murder Jews. And the more Jews they murder, the higher their lifetime pension. Who calls Jews filthy. Who names schools, streets, and sports teams and children's camps after Jew killers. Who has parades for terrorists after they die. Who honors them in every way, shape, and form. Who's refused to even negotiate for 12 years. And when we should be making this clear, both Israeli leaders and Jewish leaders and the Jewish media. And in fact, when Abbas was offered 97% of Judea and Samaria, 3% of Israel, a Palestinian state, billions in aid, I asked Ehud Olmert, who offered this insane deal, I said, why didn't he take it? What's going on? I'm in shock. He says, Abbas told me, this is Olmert speaking to me, Abbas told me you must get rid of 3 clauses in it. 1, that we support Israel as a Jewish state. I won't do it. 2, that we can't bring as many refugees as we want to Israel, eliminating Israel as a Jewish state. 3, you must eliminate the clause, no further claims. And Olmert says, what do you mean no further claims? We're making a deal, you're getting all this, it's over. Nobody knows what I just told you. Israelis should make this crystal clear that this man is a monster, terrorist, dictator, no election since 2005, to destroy his image of moderacy. So there's reduced sympathy for the Palestinian Authority, which is not reduced. College kids certainly, and people all over have sympathy for the Arabs, thinking they're lovely, they just want peace, and the Israelis are killing them and oppressing them. And of course, we should talk about statehood, that this will be a Hamas-Iran state. The polls show Hamas will clearly win any election over Fatah. It'll be a Hamas-Iran state. We also should be showing, by the way, the emblem of the Palestinian Authority Fatah Party, which shows all of Israel, including Judea and Samaria and Gaza and Jerusalem, with a keffiyeh over all of it, with Arafat in the center and a Kalashnikov rifle. If people knew about this, when I show people this in my speeches, they're in shock. This shows they have no interest in peace. We have to make it clear what monsters the Palestinian Authority is, to reduce sympathy with them. This would help Israel, I think, enormously. So the truth is all on the side of Israel in its Islamic war against Israel, and we don't make use of it. Not Jewish leaders, not Israeli leaders, not the Jewish media, not the Israeli media. And I think this is a major failing. And if we did this, there'd be I think a significant transformation in sympathy from the Palestinian Authority to sympathy for Israel. I don't know if that was an appropriate comment for this meeting, but
absolutely.
That's
more, it's a very helpful treatment of the underlying dynamic. And I hope that our committee, with your help, will be very much involved in the truth-telling business in support of a robust government of Israel, safeguarding its own security, of course, but in the process also advancing that of the United States, and I think others who seek peace, genuine peace in the Middle East, as opposed to those who, truth be told, seek, I think, destruction of freedom-loving people like us. We're going to turn next to a woman who has spent an awful lot of time of late, in particular, assessing others who are also hostile to the state of Israel and, frankly, to the United States of America. Others who have sought their fundamental transformation or outright destruction. Some of whom are, as we've heard already, engaged in doing so through elections in Israel and through other techniques, diplomatic, political, economic, and the like. Her name is Dr. Karen Sigeman. She runs a terrific organization in California, the American Freedom Alliance. A particular focus of effort of late has been the globalist phenomenon. She had a program in early October entitled The Globalist Puppet Masters, in which she and her team examined with great care who these folks are, the World Economic Forum, Davos, well, others who share, if not in all of the particulars, the end game of the globalists, certainly the desire, the necessity of removing the United States and friendly nations like Israel as impediments to realizing their objectives. And I would include in that group the Chinese Communist Party and the Sharia supremacists who are anxious to bring about a global caliphate. Again, different end states perhaps, but a shared immediate objective, which is removing us as the impediment to the realization of their goals. Karen Sigeman is going to talk with us a bit about how those in the World Economic Forum and these other globalists and the left more generally and its allies are anxious not to have a special relationship restored between the United States and Israel, and why we should be doing everything to defeat them in that purpose. Karen Sigeman, it's great to have you with us. Over to you.
Frank, great to be here, and it's a real honor to be among this amazing, amazing committee and group. And I think that the work that you're doing, that we are going to be doing, is hugely important. As far as the globalists, what are their goals? First of all, obviously, it's total global control. What does that mean? No borders, no national sovereignty. You can't have borders if you're going to be globalists. We're watching borders being erased around the world, including here in the United States. You can't have a Judeo-Christian foundation. Why not? Because that brings with it a moral compass. It brings with it primacy of the individual over the collective, which has already been mentioned. It celebrates and elevates the individual over the collective. We, the people, are no longer allowed to rule. Ruling comes from above. What Caroline Glick just walked us through, all the complexity of elections in Israel, hugely complicated, trying to come up with the best way of representative government. We've also seen this in Europe. But what do we know about Europe? When Europe has their elections, it sort of has the feeling of a charade. Why? Because it's the European Union that, in fact, has the levers of power, rather than those who appear to be elected by the people. It has morality as a basis. Judeo-Christian values do. And there's no other compass. Globalists seek to destroy that. There's the destruction of community under globalism. There's no local control. It all comes from on high. It requires total control of everywhere, of every tier of government, and of the entire globe. Now, why is this important in this context? Because Israel, in every aspect, is a bulwark against all of these things. Again, their election, the people have control. Obviously, there's a Judaic compass to their nation. It's a Jewish nation, which is a double whammy. There's the religion aspect of it, and the notion of a nation. Under globalism, you're not allowed to have a nation. So that's why it's in their sights as well. It's a double whammy. I also wind up thinking about Israel. I know there are many differences, but I think about it in similar terms to how West Berlin had been during the Cold War. It was an outpost. It was surrounded by those who hate it, who want to see it destroyed, but who see it as a constant reminder of all that can be and is in fact good and prosperous and free and happy and joyous. And again, I'm just going to say the word again, free. Israel is a constant reminder in that region of what freedom looks like. And that freedom, again, is a constant reminder, the very existence of Israel in that corner of the world, as was West Berlin, that they espouse those characteristics, policies, ideologies that bring, in fact, prosperity. To have that in your midst can only be a gigantic thorn in one side. Why do they want it eliminated? That many, many reasons, but that absolutely is one of them. It is an outpost. It's been an outpost. It needs always to be an outpost, but because it's an outpost is why it comes under attack. We talked about the guerrillas in the room. Exactly right. These are the guerrillas. We are the guerrilla. They are a guerrilla. We need more guerrillas, not fewer guerrillas. We need more nations on the side of freedom, of the values that lead to prosperity. We need more nations. Another comparison that I wanted to draw, it was just mentioned by Mort Klein, this revisionism. Same thing in the United States. We are undergoing a leftist revisionist view. similar to the revisionism regarding Jerusalem, Israel, and quote, Palestine. So the truth is on our side, freedom is on our side. Freedom and truth bring prosperity. It empowers the individual wherever there are places that we can uphold these values. We must do so. And because we do so is why they are under attack. So it's clear to me that the stronger the globalists attack, the more important these outposts are. And we have to do everything that we can always to maintain this relationship, to uphold those values that underlie everything that is good and great in Israel. And I'm full of anticipation for what's going to happen tomorrow here in the United States. I hope that we turn back to freedom-loving, truth-loving, Israel-supporting governance and ideology that we have here. Now, it's also important to remember, or that we always used to have, and especially did under President Trump. All it takes for darkness to be dispelled is a tiny bit of light. Doesn't need a whole lot of light, just a little bit of light. Israel is pretty big light. The United States, of course, has always been the biggest caster of great light. Again, that's why they hate us, but that's why we've got to keep shining. We've got to unite our light with that of Israel. We've got to keep on the side of freedom, of truth, of justice, of we the people, of Judeo-Christian ideology, and all those policies and ideologies that lead to prosperity and freedom and individual empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen Sigerman. Marvelous depiction of the reasons they hate us, as you said, and why it makes it absolutely imperative that we join forces with others who seek truth, who seek freedom, who seek opportunities for individuals and all the rest that goes with it, to resist these enemies. And casting light into that darkness is what we're all about here at the Center for Security Policy, and all of these wonderful organizations coming together behind this committee to restore the U.S. Israel strategic relationship. And I'm very pleased to introduce finally Pastor Kevin Jessup, a man who has been through his Global Strategic Alliance Ministries and in a variety of other capacities, a tremendously energetic advocate for those qualities, for freedom, for the truth, for, a faith-based approach to our challenges, security and otherwise. He is the driving force behind several really extraordinary international events, the renewal, the return. And he is now actively involved with the government of Israel and like-minded individuals there, both Christians and Jews, by the way, to promote the security of the state of Israel and very, very strategically vital relationship between our country and that of the Jewish state. We're delighted to have him with us for concluding remarks. Kevin Jessup, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Frank. It's an honor to be with you and all of the distinguished guests here today. I remember back in 2017, I was invited by President Reuven Rivlin to come to the first Jerusalem prayer breakfast. And prior to that, I had met with Ron Dermer and, of course, Danny Danon, the UN ambassador to Israel at the time when he was there. And very tremendous people. I often say Christianity was born out of the womb of Judaism, and America has a spiritual umbilical cord tied to Israel that can and must never be severed. And so I want to turn to the scripture just briefly here to give some insight and context of where we are, and then talk briefly about what we're doing in the state of Israel to stand with them against the delegitimization of the state of Israel, against BDS, against anti-Semitism that seems to be on the rise globally. And it's time that we stand with our greatest ally in all the world, Israel. But first, you know, it's incredible to see what Hashem says in the scriptures. Psalm 2 says, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains," they say, "and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill." I read that scripture just to say that God Almighty, our Lord, is still on the throne, and he still has everything in his hand. He has everything in control. And we are moving into an area of time that the Holy Scriptures talks about, called the restitution of all things. And in the future, the season called the times of restitution, or the fullness of times, indicates that the holy prophets were given insights into these seasons of restitution since the beginning of the world. And I gave this speech, the restitution of all things, at the Jerusalem prayer breakfast. And recently we met with Prime Minister Netanyahu at the Knesset just a few months ago, and had private meetings with him and Mr. Robert Ilitoff, who is the chairman of the Jerusalem prayer breakfast, who was blessed by President Reuven Rivlin to initiate in 2017 the Jerusalem prayer breakfast, which now has gone all around the world. And so and this is bringing evangelical Christians and our Jewish brothers together, which was prophesied also in the Holy Scriptures. The Greek word for times of refreshing is kairos, which means a set opportunity. And the Greek word for times of restitution is chronos, meaning a space of time or season. The reason I say this is because there are periods or seasons when the restitution or fulfillment of biblical prophecies begin to occur on a constant basis. And according to the Hebrew prophets, especially those who penned the Old Testament scriptures, certain key events will come to pass, thrusting the world into seasons of restoration, climaxing in the return of Messiah. And these times of restitution begin to transpire during God-appointed seasons or in a series of phases. And I personally am convinced that this restitution began with the reestablishment of the modern state of Israel. And this modern miracle did not officially occur until 1948. But nothing could have occurred in these end times as we see them approaching until Israel was first a nation and the Jews had a homeland. I say this because the major end time prophecies in all of the Holy Scriptures, both Testaments, deal with Israel, Jerusalem, and the Jews. The restitution includes Israel being restored in Isaiah 66:8, Jerusalem becoming the capital in Psalm 102, the Jews returning from the Gentile nations, Jeremiah 16, which we're seeing happening today, and the blossoming of the land to produce fruit in Isaiah 35, and the rise of Israel as a nation among nations, as we see in Ezekiel 36 and Ezekiel 37. In fact, in Ezekiel 36, it says, they will say, this land that was laid waste has become like a Garden of Eden. The cities that were lying in ruins, desolate and destroyed, are now fortified and inhabited. Then the nations around you that remain will know that I, the Lord, have rebuilt what was destroyed and have replanted what was desolate. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I will do it. And we're watching this happen now today in Israel. If God's original everlasting covenant with Abraham regarding his chosen people is still valid, the land will give testimony to that as well. And no other group of people in human history has been planted on a piece of land, forcibly removed, then returned after 70 years to the same piece of land, then forcibly removed again and scattered to the ends of the earth for 2,000 years, then return a second time to the exact same piece of real estate as an identifiable people with the same customs, language, and beliefs as their ancient ancestors. What we're seeing is the biblical prophecies of Ezekiel 36 and 7 coming alive right before our very eyes. And all the while, their homeland cease to produce until their return. If God's covenant promise to Abraham and Ezekiel's prophecies are to be believed in a literal way, then through the land's miraculous transformation, which we're now seeing, we're beginning to witness one of the greatest demonstration of God's faithfulness to his promises in the last several thousand years. The prophecy states that at some point, the land's transformation will be so stunning in the scope of its history that the nations will recognize that only God could have done it. According to the scriptures, he is calling the nations to himself, and he's using the land of Israel to do it, and it's happening now right before our eyes. It's not simply the land whose revival was foretold, but the people as well. 3 times in Ezekiel 36, the idea of national cleansing is connected to the return of the Jewish people to their land and the physical renewal of the land itself. In fact, many times throughout other prophetic scriptures, when the return of the Jewish people to the land is mentioned, so is the arrival of Messiah, who will bring about a restoration to God. So regardless of our personal beliefs, history has shown us that what is happening in Israel has never been seen before. God is faithful to his people, his land, and to the people and nations that recognize his hand in these amazing transformations. And we're watching Ezekiel's prophecy come to pass in its fullness today. We are working directly with Robert Ilitoff, who adheres to his conservative views, actively advocating for strengthening the state of Israel at all levels, technological, social, economic, and promoting Israel on the international arena. As you know, Frank, I spent 2 years in Jerusalem at the International Christian Embassy, developing in over 100 nations around the world, diplomatic discourse for national planning, public diplomacy, and sound doctrine. And so it is with this that we are excited to talk about the national security of Israel with Robert Ilitoff. We'll be hosting him here in America across the universities, large evangelical Christian churches, and throughout the media, including some of your programs. So we are working with the ARAD Research and Innovation Center to promote Israeli high-tech industries and maintain Israel's preeminence as a global technological powerhouse there with the Negev project, where the hope is to bring about 400,000 Russian immigrants back in and 200,000 Ukrainian through Aliyah immigrants back in. Sorry about that. You're on mute, Frank. Sorry.
Pastor Jessup, thank you very much. This is a very important part of the larger problem that we're dealing with, which is the underpinnings of the faith in Israel and the confidence in the triumph of that faith going forward. This brings us to the conclusion of these really important presentations. I did want to just say at the beginning of a quick round of Q&A that what we hope to do with this committee to renew the U.S. Israel special relationship for reasons that have been very, very well laid out here is a multiple series of priorities involving support for a robust government of Israel, strengthening, wherever possible, expanding the Abraham Accords, restocking the Iron Dome munitions that have been depleted as a result of the various attacks on Israel, backing Israel in the steps that it must take to defend itself against threats from Iran and its proxies, helping the Iranian people bring down the regime in Tehran that brutally oppresses them and threatens both the United States and Israel, oppose and, if necessary, defund a U.S. consulate that the Biden administration has proposed to create in Jerusalem for the Palestinians, and support the ongoing work of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, enforce the Taylor Force Act by denying U.S. funding for Palestinian terrorists and their families, and oppose illegal Palestinian construction in Judea and Samaria that would impede or otherwise harm Israel's maintenance of security there. in all of these respects, we believe there's a very full agenda, and other priorities will emerge, I'm sure. But this is the kind of work that we believe people who perceive in Israel a vital strategic ally and partner, and who believe that that gives rise to an imperative need for, once again, a special relationship between the United States and Israel, must be working very assiduously to promote those priorities. And we will be doing that with the help of this team and many others, I'm confident. Let me just open this up to a couple of questions quickly. We're almost out of time, but I did want to just give each of you a chance to speak to one or more points that that others have made. There has, it seems now, been growing evidence of the United States government, either directly or indirectly, engaging in election interference in Israel to try to prevent Bibi Netanyahu's victory and promote Arab parties, including the Muslim Brotherhoods. Carolyn Glick, I would just ask you, I guess, for starters, to comment on that and the extent to which this is not a novel practice on the part of this particular U.S. government, but one that is completely at odds with the traditions of not interfering in the elections of friendly governments. Carolyn? I think you may be on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I think that in that regard, I think that there's a bit of a myth about U.S. non-intervention in Israeli elections, and I think it speaks to something that Dave Wormser was talking about in his remarks about how America's attachment to the false and anti-Israel, extremely anti-Israel policy paradigm of a two-state solution has really blinded the United States to the importance of a strong Israel and to the need for a special alliance between, a very strong alliance between Israel and the United States, between the United States and Israel from an American perspective. And so as a result of this blindness, we've seen that since the Bush administration, the first Bush administration in 1992, became extremely attached to the notion that Israel was the reason that there was no peace in the Middle East, and their attempt to coddle the Palestine Liberation Organization, that you have had U.S. governments interfering with Israel's elections on behalf of the left against the right. So we've seen that repeatedly in U.S. Israel relations, with America acting to subvert the will of the Israeli people on behalf of the Israeli left against the Israeli right. And I think it's important to just point that out. This has been a bipartisan blindness that has afflicted both the Republicans and the Democrats, is their belief that there's something fundamentally wrong with a strong Israel that's able to assert its authority in its sovereign territory, and also in areas that it administers in Judea and Samaria and in Jerusalem. So we have had that. In the most prominent and blatant and unlawful example of that was the Obama State Department's funding of an anti-Netanyahu NGO in the 2015 elections called Victory 15. It was run by the person who directed Obama's field operations in his reelection campaign in 2012. So this was all very much an Obama political operation paid for by U.S. taxpayers against a sitting Israeli prime minister in the middle of an election in 2015. In last week's election, we haven't seen specific evidence of U.S. governmental interference. We've seen instead massive effort by progressive U.S. Jewish groups to get out the vote in the Arab sector, which is notable because the three Arab parties that were running for the Knesset last week are all anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, pro-terrorism parties, and yet you had progressive Jewish organizations that are so far unnamed, allegedly spending millions of dollars to try to get out the Arab vote, to increase the Arab vote share in the elections, which is something I think that itself is unprecedented, that the money is coming from American Jewish progressives to undermine the will of the people on behalf of anti-Semitic parties, pro-terrorist parties in Israel's Arab community. So that's something that we saw for the first time. And I think that really it goes to the heart of America's own confusion about how whether it even has a right to a national interest, and if so, whether it ought to be advancing it, because the positions of foreign policies that are being advanced by the Biden administration, whether in Latin America or the Middle East or in Europe or elsewhere, are very antithetical to American national security interests as they've normally been defined by American foreign policy experts and by Americans really just with common sense since the end of World War II at a minimum.
Yeah.
And so I think that, you know, we're seeing here also a function of a very anti-American foreign policy that the Biden administration has been advancing. I think that for Israel, that the best way to get around this is the same way that we got around it with the Obama administration, which is by expanding our ties to our regional neighbors, to the Gulf Arab states and to the Sunni Arab states more generally that are opposed to Iran and its rise and are, as Harold was mentioning, extremely frightened by the way that American foreign policy is being made by the Biden administration. Netanyahu said, and I think this is very important, I think it was perhaps the most important substantive thing that he said in the election campaign, was that it is his intention upon returning to office to develop peaceful ties with Saudi Arabia, to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords. Now, from a personal perspective, I don't think it much matters whether Israel's relations with the Saudis is above the table or under the table, but I think that Saudi Arabia views Israel as a lifeline right now, as a rescue boat in the storm of American strategic blindness and hostility towards its traditional Arab allies and towards Israel. That was how it was under the Obama administration, and that is how it is today. So I think that for Israel, it's very important to expand our ties with the Saudis right now and to work with them to ensure that we're able to survive this very hostile American administration. And I look forward as well to an incoming, I hope, Republican leadership in the House and hopefully in the Senate as well, who will be able to work with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, and with other regional partners to minimize the amount of harm that the Biden administration and its progressive allies can continue to do to Israel and its allies. And just one last thing that I want to say before saying so long is that the Jerusalem consulate issue is essentially, I mean, it would seem to me rather dead right now, because even in the last government, because there were some sort of never Bibi, like never Trump, never Bibi right-wingers in the party, sort of the Lincoln Project of Israel representatives in the outgoing government, the Americans were not able to secure Israeli approval for the opening of a consul general for the Palestinians in Jerusalem, because you need 2 signatures on the approval by the Israeli government for that, the prime minister and the justice minister. And the justice minister, the outgoing justice minister, is a never Bibi moderate right-winger who went to the left named Gideon Sa'ar, and Gideon refused to sign it. So since it didn't get signed in the outgoing coalition, it definitely won't get signed in this coalition. Netanyahu would never approve it. So I don't think that, and neither would any minister in his incoming government. So I think that we can put that to the side. I don't think that the administration is going to be able to open a consulate. I may be wrong, but that's the legal status of the issue as far as I can tell.
Well, that's good news indeed. If the U.S. government will not try to simply brazen this out on its own, but
That they will, but there you
yeah.
also have Republican control of the purse in the House will make it very difficult as a practical matter for them to operate such
We
a.
shall see. And that's a
bill.
question I want to, we're almost out of time, and I'll do no justice to anybody else, unfortunately, if I don't get a couple of questions off quickly. David Wormser, Carolyn has rightly pointed out that there's a possible red wave coming with Republicans in the next 24 hours or so. Talk to us, if you would, a bit about how Republicans seem to be shaping up on this issue of restoring the special relationship. I've not seen much evidence of their sort of independent thinking on Israel in the face of the rising anti-Semitism, certainly anti-Zionism of the Democrats. Your thoughts quickly on that, please?
Well, yeah, I think that the bulk of the Republican Party is very pro-Israeli. I mean, both the Trump camp and even some of the anti-Trump camp has been traditionally pro-Israeli. They understand Israel as a foundation of American policy in the region. They also understand the Judeo-Christian foundations of Israel in the United States. They all focus on the progressive attack on America, which is an attack on history, on our identity, on who we are. And they know that Bibi particularly embodies an impressive sense of history and helps even Americans reestablish and reconnect with their own history. We saw that with his speeches to Congress, where he talked about Lincoln and so forth, and reminded us of our own foundation. So I think that part of the project with Israel is the restoration of history. And there's a lot to be said about it. I'm not going to get into it. Even the word Palestine, there's a lot to be said about all that. But I think a huge part of it is the restoration of history. And in that, they can find quite a bit of consensus on the Republican side, even in the camp that doesn't want to continue to have a very engaged American policy in the region. So I'll
Good.
leave it at
Thanks.
that.
Another testament to the importance of truth telling. Harold
Yes.
Rode, we've been talking about Saudi Arabia. You did a bit, and Carolyn just now has referred to it. The idea that Saudi Arabia wants to remain in sort of the Western security orbit under sponsorship of Israel, if not the United States, but preferably both, is somewhat belied by the response to the Biden team and sort of cultivation by the Saudis of a relationship with the Chinese. Knowing what you do about Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi royal family more generally, how do you make book on whether they would in fact do what we're hopeful they might do with Israel under Bibi and Netanyahu?
Well, look, the bottom line is that they want to stay in power. They don't want to be overthrown. And if they can't rely on America, they got to look elsewhere. Under the previous Israeli government, the outgoing Israeli government, there wasn't much to rely on there either. And that's why they went to Russia. That's why they are prepared to deal with China. But the Americans, if they can rely on it, are their natural allies they've been historically. Anywhere that the Chinese and the Russians get involved with, in the end, doesn't work. That's their bottom line. Do I know this? I don't know Mohammed bin Salman personally, but I know how. I've watched how the Saudis think for them it's generations already. Survival is the key. Israel and the United States, if we have a red wave tomorrow, God willing, should be able to say, we are all in this together. America, Israel, the Saudis, and others, and we're one team where we have just natural alliance. With Russia and China, they don't.
Harold, thank you. Mort Klein, the issue of differences within the Jewish community here in the United States is something you touched on. Carolyn mentioned that some groups within the left inside that community have been actively involved in the election, trying to promote Arab parties of all things that are very hostile to Israel, not just to the Jews. When you look at the challenge that you have lived with as a leader of the American Jewish community, of sort of fratricide within that community, does the crushing, and I don't think that's too strong a term, of the left in these elections in Israel make more likely a coming together here inside the Jewish community behind this new premier and hopefully a new special relationship between the United States and Israel?
Look, you've already had the American Jewish Committee, Ted Deutsch, who's my friend, liberal Democrat. First of all, I thought it was a mistake to make him the new head, to make any politician the new head of an organization. Obviously, immediately they're partisan. He's already publicly attacked Ben-Gvir. I mean, Gvir hasn't done anything. Gvir hasn't done anything for decades, and he already attacked him. The organized Jewish community desperately wants a Palestinian state. Says positive things about Mahmoud Abbas. In fact, the Shaked came to all the Jewish organizations, begged us to publicly come out against opening a consulate in Jerusalem, begged us to. Do you know not a single Jewish organization except ZOA came out against it? Zero. They're just hopelessly left-wing, hopelessly appeasing. They're frightened appeasers is the best label for them. I don't think it'll change much. And I wanted to ask this group, since I believe, I think it's true, this is more a religious war than a war about land. It's Israel's very existence. It's not about land. Israel has offered a state to the Palestinian Arabs 4 times in the last 20 years, 8 times in the last 80 years. It's been turned down every time without a counteroffer. This is something that's really not known to most people. And I wonder, and when I asked Bibi myself about this religious war versus a war about, it's not about land, he pleaded with me, don't bring this up because we can't resolve it if it's a religious war. And I said, but if that's the truth, we better talk about it, what to do about it. It's like saying, you know, I lost my keys in the basement, but the light is better in the living room, so I'll look in the living room.
Right.
If it's a religious war, we better deal with it. And Netanyahu said, they'll accuse me of being against peace. So afraid. He's so afraid. So no, I don't think there'll be a significant change. And you saw groups of already, a number of them condemning Ben-Gvir, who never condemn Abbas, who never condemned their horrific Nazi-like policies, monsters. So no, I don't see any change. And I wonder if you and others think, should we push this issue that this is really a religious war more than a war about land, or not?
We'll come back to that in a moment with Pastor Kevin Jessup, the issue of what I would call a spiritual warfare component to all of this, which is, to my way of thinking, very much a topic for our work as a committee. But before we get there, Karen Sigeman, to you, when you talk about Europe as part of this sort of globalist enterprise that is deeply hostile to the Jewish state, as well as to, for that matter, the United States, I'm struck by the fact that Israel is, praise God, now in a position, though a little less thanks to a deal that the Biden administration brokered with Hezbollah, but nonetheless still endowed with enormous natural gas resources that could be of incalculable importance to Europe, especially if possible in the short term, this hard winter coming ahead. Is that likely to have any ameliorating effect, do you think, with the attitude of the European Union, for example, and European nations more generally, towards the Jewish state and its vital security interests and role?
It's a great question. I think a lot of that presupposes, I'm going to use a terrible word, rationality. I think that Europe is in the desperate straits that they're in, energy wise and in every other way, because of embracing a whole lot of irrationality. Their ideology has been counter to national interests, counter to national security, counter to their own cultural interests, counter to, again, reality related to heating and food and farmers' well-being and so on, counter to rationality regarding medicine, as we saw during COVID, and health and mental health and physical health. So I like the idea that there may be some realistic motivation in having greater closeness to Israel because of the power issue. But we've seen time after time after time a rejection of realistic solutions, realistic policies, realistic ideas in terms of what we would like to think of would be existential preservation. So it's a great question. I've sort of given up on the idea that rationality plays a role in a lot of what one would hope would be strategic decisions. We see them here, we see them in Europe. It's been suicidal in more ways than I care to think about here and there. And this casting aside of rationality, national interest, national security, it's a bizarre time to recognize that something may well be to the good and yet will be cast aside.
Yeah. Well, again, it makes all the more important, I think, the work we're about. And I
Yeah.
thank you for being part of it with the American Freedom Alliance. Lastly, Kevin Jessup, and I'm afraid very quickly, if you could, would you speak to this issue that that Mort has just raised, of whether at the end of the day, the ultimate truth is there is a contest, a mortal struggle to the death, alas, between good and evil. This is something that our faiths address innumerable ways. But I wonder whether or not it is necessary, and you are working both with the faith community here and in Israel and with the political leadership, as you've mentioned, in both countries, to do other than recognize that there is spiritual warfare underway here. And we have to engage in this fight at that level as well as others. Your thoughts, Pastor Jessup? You're muted, I'm afraid, Pastor.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, it all started back with Ishmael and Isaac, the two brothers, and we take that all the way through Jacob and Esau. We take it through Joseph and his two sons, which Jacob inherited as his own, Manasseh and Ephraim. So we see this ongoing battle between these two brothers. And in Hosea 6:1-3, it says, "Come and let us return," or shuv, return to the Lord, for he is torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up that we may live in his sight. And so there's so much to unpack just in that one scripture, but it is a spiritual war. And the Bible is the title deed for Israel. And so I think it's important that as we continue our conversations, even with Robert Ilitoff there at the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast with Bibi, we're talking about two major things: the national security of the state of Israel, which includes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Iranian nuclear program, and the BDS movement. And secondly, the Zionism movement, the Aliyah movement, the settlement movement, and what do all of these have to do with the ramifications of Israel? It's important to maintain Israel with its Jewish roots. And there is a Zionism and preserving of the Judeo-Christian principles, the importance of strengthening ties between Israel and evangelical Christians. So it is a spiritual war. Bibi is correct in that. And that Romans 9:11 talks about the healing. The whole Bible is a story about a loving father looking for a virtuous bride for a son so they can have a global family. and God, Yeshua, can come and tabernacle with his people. And that's where we are headed now, with Jew and Gentile coming together. And there's going to be healing in these final days of restoration.
From your lips to God's ears, as they say. I think you meant to say that Mark Klein is right. Bibi hopefully will be coming around on this issue of spiritual warfare. And with the mandate that he has now received, he has an opportunity to do that. We believe that it is imperative that the United States stand with him to that end and restore the special relationship. Our new committee is literally brand new. We're rolling it out today. I want to thank those who've participated in this program. Carolyn Glick-Suiza, David Wormser, Dr. Harold Rode, Morton Klein, Karen Sigeman, and also, of course, Kevin Jessup, for your really important contributions to the launch of this new committee on the renewing, I should say, the U.S. Israel special relationship. You can find out more over time at cruiser.info. That's CRUISR.info. And we look forward to working with all of you to try to reestablish, rebuild, renew, restore, and otherwise reinvigorate a relationship that is vital, I believe, and I think we all do, to the security not only of the Jewish people in Israel, but also to those Americans here at home and around the world. Thank you very much for joining us for this edition of our Center for Security Policy webinar series. We are deeply appreciative of you joining us early for our breakfast version, and we will be back with more in the days to come. Stay tuned at securefreedom.org for more on all of this. God bless you all.